This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Dunn, and I'm a professor in the Department of Religion here at Emory University. And welcome back. Well, I hope you've had a good lunch. We certainly did, and we also had a very interesting discussion about the Emory Tibet Science Initiative. His Holiness was quite animated, and I suspect we'll get some more of that animation this afternoon. Your Holiness, this afternoon we're going to move from a set of discussions that was mostly about the science of compassion to something that's going to integrate a little more a discussion of practice. What we will begin with today is a presentation by the Venerable Mathieu Ricard, who will discuss the nature of compassion and how it might be cultivated. We will then move on to a presentation by Geshe Losang Tenzin, and please note in your program that this is a new order of the presentations. And Geshe Losang Tenzin will discuss a secularized form of compassion practice that he has developed in association with various colleagues here at Emory University. He'll talk about the nature of that practice, some of the challenges perhaps in developing it. Then Professor Chuck Raison, who has worked with Geshe Losang Tenzin in the development of this practice, will speak to us about some of the results that have emerged as a result of implementing this practice in various contexts. And then finally, Brennan Lazaro da Silva will tell you something about the use of this style of practice for children, actually, including foster children, some of the challenges that arise there, and some of what it means to secularize a practice. And so, Your Holiness, if I might introduce to you the first speaker, indeed, I doubt very much that he needs very much introduction for you, but perhaps for our audience, allow me to introduce the Venerable Mathieu Ricard. Mathieu Ricard actually received a PhD in cell genetics, as you heard this morning, and then promptly became a Buddhist monk thereafter. He's been a monk for a very long time, but he's actually remained a scientist, and he has been instrumental in the development of what you might call contemplative neuroscience, partnering especially with Richie Davidson and earlier with Francisco Varela in the design of experiments to examine contemplative practices and in their interpretation. He's also an accomplished photographer and an author. He's written with his father, Jean-François Revel, the very well-known book, The Monk and the Philosopher. Also, more recently, Happiness, another excellent book. And then even more recently, Why Meditate, which was actually #1 in France for quite a while, I believe, on the Amazon French site. So Mathieu today will be speaking to us about this question: can altruism and compassion be cultivated? Mathieu?
Thank you. So it is certainly a quite unthinkable situation that I often find myself having to speak about compassion in front of His Holiness. It's like lighting a match in a bright sunlight, but somehow, I don't know, it's just sometimes happens that I have to do that. So I apologize. So the idea was to explain a little bit in the Buddhist context what are the meanings of altruistic love, compassion, perhaps empathy as well, and also to consider different aspects, emotional and cognitive, and can those be cultivated? And then, of course, the collaboration with science. What did we mutually learn? Are there some insights from both sides? I remember speaking with our dear friend Stephen Koslin at Harvard. He was very, very upset when he was asking, what do you get out of that? And I was thinking, when we are in my hermitage, what do I really change my practice? And I said, not much, and he was very upset about that. But in fact, over the years, we did learn profound things by engaging more in details, especially in the nuances of compassion. And I will say a few words referring to one or two of the research. So first of all, there are simple definitions in the Buddhist teachings. Altruistic love is the wish that may all sentient beings find happiness and the causes of happiness. And that's go very far, as we will see. Now, compassion is simply what happens to that unconditional benevolence when it encounters suffering. It naturally becomes, may all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So the causes of suffering is the most important addition to the mere wish may beings cease to suffer, because it addresses what is honest mentioned this morning. Suffering is not just the obvious suffering, ordinary suffering of a headache or a mental suffering, or even a more tragic, a massacre, something that is heart-rending that we can witness and we want to dispel. But it also tries to go much deeper. What are the underlying causes of that? We could say that there is no war that didn't start with a thought of hatred in someone's mind that then spread to others' mind, or cruelty, or indifference, or greed. So there are mental states that are somehow the primary causes of suffering. And then even deeper than that, according to the Buddhist approach, there's this concept of suffering also comes, those mental toxins, where do they come from? They do come from a distortion of reality. Because I suddenly label, project onto a person, a group, a nation, the concept of those are 100% evil, enemies. And I feel that it belongs to them, it's intrinsic to them. Or just greed makes me see something as 100% desirable. I cannot live without that, and that becomes 100% desirable. Those are clearly distortions of reality. And so basic ignorance, and in Buddhist terms, ignorance is just not a mere lack of information, that you don't know the telephone directory by heart. Ignorance is a misperception of reality. You perceive as permanent what is not. You perceive as autonomous entity, which is interrelated. You perceive that there's a solid autonomous self, which divides you intrinsically from others when there's no such thing. So therefore, as you can see, in wishing that may the causes of suffering be dispelled, now there is a wisdom aspect that is indispensable. You cannot remedy to the deeper cause of suffering without having a better understanding of the nature of mind, a better understanding of the nature of reality. So in that sense, reacting with empathy to the suffering of others has to be grounded in understanding of those deeper causes. And as is mentioned this morning, this is also what gives the magnitude, the dimension of the compassion. So, because for instance, once His Holiness gave a wonderful example in Paris. He said, if you were from an aeroplane seeing someone who is drowning in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there's nothing we can do. So pity will be there, but it's hopeless. Now, if there is an island that is just nearby, is hidden in the mist, but there is a way, there is a possibility that that person might reach to the island. So then the compassion, the wish, may that person find a way, because there is a way, becomes so much greater. So as part of the four fundamental noble truths, it's not just recognizing the all-pervasiveness of suffering as a very pessimistic perception of the condition of samsara. It is also saying these are cause. These not come at random. They have not been imposed by some immanent cause. There are countless causes and conditions coming together. By nature, those are impermanent. You can bring a new set of causes and conditions in the picture. There's a possibility of the cessation of suffering. and therefore there are methods to achieve that. So that suddenly gives a complete different dimension to compassion. So in that sense, from that perspective, we can see how we can extend compassion to others and to all, not only those whom you like, but also those who are obnoxious people. Well, you know, very well-known French philosopher said, it's too much asking to love an enemy. So what do we mean by that? Do we like a bloody dictator? It's not about that. It's not saying to the dictator, here's a ticket for holiday in the Bahamas, please have a good time, after all you didn't do such a bad job. It's nothing about approving even remotely his actions. It is more that compassion and loving kindness are not reward for good behavior. The absence is not, or the withdrawal is not a punishment for bad behavior. Compassion has to address all suffering in all forms and all aspects. So it's more like looking at a most obnoxious person like a physician would look at an insane person. If an insane person comes to see the physician, if he's violent, he might try to restrain him, but the next step is not going to take a big stick and beat the patient. He's going to find out, is there any way that this very, very sick patient could be cured? So the compassion for an obnoxious dictator, a bloody dictator, is not to wish him success, is to wish may the hatred, may the cruelty that is invading his mind disappear. So of course, the more that dictator is harmful, the more that we should be strong. It has nothing to do with approving his or her conduct. So moral judgment is something different. Compassion addresses sufferings in all forms. So as His Holiness often mentioned, there's a biological aspect to compassion that's very natural, instinctive towards those who are dear to us. We don't need to force ourselves to wish them good, to wish to be safe, to wish to be free from suffering. A mother finds unbearable to see her child suffer. But to extend that, we need first a cognitive reflection. Then we need to cultivate that, because it's not so natural to extend that, especially to an enemy. So that's where the aspect of cultivation comes from. So how do we will proceed? First of all, we need to identify that state of mind that wishes unconditional well-being to others. So we begin with something that is easy. A dear one, an innocent child that comes in front of us with bright eyes, and then spontaneously, we don't have to force ourselves. We'll feel this unconditional wish. May this child be safe. May this child flourish in life. May this child be free from suffering if he suffers. That's not difficult. Usually we do have those feelings, each of us, but it comes and goes. We don't cultivate those. They're soon replaced by other mental states. There's no compassion gymnasium as we go for fitness on this bicycle in our apartment that goes nowhere, not even in the kitchen. We don't have compassion gymnasium. Well, meditation is a kind of compassion gymnasium. That's an idea of Paul Ekman, to have compassion gymnasiums all over the place. We will now nurture that, revive that, maintain that for 10, 20, 15 minutes, an hour, whatever, so that it fills our mental landscape, renewing with the object. Then at some point, when that's vivid enough, we'll try to extend it to strangers, extend it to anyone. Sometimes people feel that it is like diluting out. And they say, I have special responsibility for those who are dear to me. How can I love and take care of everyone in the world like my own child? I have a special duty to them. I think there's a beautiful example, is that of the shining sun. The sun shines equally on all, but there are, because of the circumstances of life, some beings which are naturally near to you, like they are nearer from the sun, so they get naturally more warmth, But it is not because you are excluding anyone, it's just they are placed in your life very near. So it's not that the sun restrains its rays to shine only on this child. Actually, if we were doing so, this partial, focused love that will only shine on someone at the exclusion of others, it will even diminish the quality of that very love for that very child, because it will be mixed with attachment, it will be mixed with a sense of partiality, so altogether everyone will be losing. So the sense of unconditional love is not at all diluting it, it's actually just embracing all sentient beings. So that's really the concept of extending that, and that needs cultivation. It can be done. It needs training. Nothing comes just because we wish so. It would be too easy. Holiness said once that in the West we are a little bit impatient. We would like enlightenment to be easy, quick, and if possible, cheap. That doesn't work. But cheap doesn't mean that money. It means cheap in terms of doing no any kind of effort. No one has mastered the piano by playing with 2 fingers 15 seconds every 2 months. By what kind of mystery those fundamental human qualities of mindfulness, attention, loving kindness, compassion will be at the optimal state simply because we want to do that it should be like that? It will be the only thing that comes not as a skill or with training. So this is why it was very natural for contemplative to engage in that collaboration with neuroscience and psychology and biology to show the short and long-term effect of training. So Richie this morning has shown many examples of that. Only 59 seconds?
No, you can go a bit.
Okay. So I don't want to come back on the science except for one particular, since Tanya Singer could have been among us, but she could not come, a very interesting study we did on distinguishing loving kindness, compassion, and empathy. So briefly first, I want to show, oops, where's that? So those are the places from the meditators came from. You know, as a photographer, the photographer always wants to try to show their photos. So very briefly, but it is the context from where those experienced meditators came from. So you see, it's easy to meditate there than in a subway or in traffic jams. Very quiet place here. So those are the beautiful places. And then those meditators, this is what I can see at breakfast from my hermitage. So, and those are great masters, the Khyentse Rinpoche. Those are many of the students who came to the lab are students of those great masters. Here with the meditating cat. And my first teacher, Kangyo Rinpoche. And now with the, so I spare you the details, but to show that Chogyal Rinpoche, and now not only, sometimes we hear about study about Tibetan monks, but now there are equal number of lay practitioners, men and women. Here is a British doctor who did 9 years of retreat with Antoine Lutz. Mingyur Rinpoche is not as easy. We don't actually meditate like that in MRI. That would be too easy. And so here is a study which is quite interesting we did with Tanya. It's not published yet, but Tanya asked us, can meditators modulate the intensity of their compassion? You know, can you do 30% of compassion, 60% or 90%? What does that mean? Are you going to think, oh, I don't like too much this guy, I can only give him 30%? Or, no, it's mostly like something comes and you try to make it more powerful and then all what you can. So if you do that over a number of hours, and this was 22 hours in MRI in 3 days, at the end, you can see what comes as the measurement is roughly 30%, 60%, and 90%. So there's the flexibility. And likewise, can this be applied to something that we don't train for, like experience of pain? And the next one shows that, likewise, if you ask a meditator to relieve an experience of strong pain, and we did experiment on pain with burning pain, electric shocks, and all kinds of nice things. And if you try to revive that, likewise, you can do it 30%, 60%, or 90%. So this shows a flexibility. So very quickly, in 30 seconds, about the difference with empathy. There's something, you know, if you resonate with others' suffering, that's one aspect of empathy. The other one is to resonate with their joy. Now, if you imagine you are a nurse or a caregiver, And all day long, your job, day after day, is to really enter in resonance with others' suffering. This can become unbearable for the very reason that in the brain, it activates an area that is the same. You're really suffering with others. So it's possibly too much asking. So that's why burnout can come. So usually, burnout may happen, or someone say, I have to make a distance, emotional distance. But also extremely loving and warm nurses that don't feel the burnout. So we try to distinguish that, and just in 15 seconds, the meditator will ask for 2 hours to just resonate with suffering, imagining the worst suffering to someone very dear, and not bring the compassion. It's very hard in a way, but artificially to block out compassion and loving kindness. Within 2 hours, there was a complete burnout. It is really unbearable. You feel distressed, you feel powerless. So then after 2 hours, when finally you are authorized to bring up the love, unconditional love, it's like breaking a dam. Like every atom of suffering of the person, now you feel that you're filling it with an atom of love, and it's a much vaster than just resonating. And suddenly, all this distressing aspect, powerless aspect, become replaced by all-embracing, courageous compassion. There's a huge difference. So the idea then was to begin training caregivers, nurses, on metta or loving kindness meditation. That would be a wonderful way that they can still resonate with their patient without distancing themselves and yet not burn out. So just to give you an indication, on a very practical level, this can lead to wonderful achievements. And that's really the fruit of collaboration, because even the meditators learn to distinguish that they normally don't distinguish, like empathy, loving kindness, and so forth, step by step. So, there we are.
Thank you very much, Matthew. You're always a speaker that I wish we had unlimited time for, actually. Wow, that's a great image as well. Seeing these images reminds me precisely of, you showed some images, I think, in the lab with yourself, in Tanya Singer's lab, who couldn't be here. She broke her arm, Your Holiness, and was unable to come. But it's in that... Yes. So yes, we'll hopefully all have a little empathy and compassion for her as well. But in that context, I find this idea of the empathy burnout very interesting. And I'm wondering, Your Holiness, if you had some thoughts about this transition from empathy to compassion, feeling the pain of the other and moving beyond that.
So it's a fairly complex process here. Maybe it's partly a function of a cultivation and familiarity, but also partly a function of how much the individual is able to utilize the more intelligence aspects of the mind. And also one is going to see differences between individuals who think about others' suffering in a very narrow kind of focused way, and others who are able to do so within a kind of wider context. So these are going to have differences. For example, in the context of Buddhist meditation, which involves reflecting deeply upon suffering in relation to one's own existence. Now, in some instances, this kind of deep reflection on one's own suffering can lead to a kind of a stress, anxiety, and so on. But on the other hand, if that kind of meditation on suffering with relation to one's own existence is grounded within a wider understanding of the possibility of a resolution of suffering, an ending of suffering, then the more you are able to deepen your meditation on suffering, the greater your kind of vision of that freedom would become, and that would in turn lead to greater sense of kind of enthusiasm for searching for that freedom. Other than that, I've not much to say.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for a wonderful presentation. We've already run out of time, so we will move on now, play a little musical chairs. But first, thank you again, Matthew. And hopefully, as the afternoon progresses, we'll have an opportunity for a little more conversation among our panelists, and I do want to encourage our panelists to break in when they have the chance. Your Holiness, I'm very pleased to introduce to you and also to the audience someone whom, again, you know very well. This is Geshe Losum Tenzin Negi. He is one of the few people in the world who has obtained the highest monastic degree in the Tibetan context and also our highest academic degree in the Western context. He completed his Geshe degree, but also his PhD here at Emory University in the Institute for Liberal Arts, in which he focused actually on a dissertation involving an analysis of the emotions from a Buddhist and psychological perspective. He's an accomplished teacher, of course, director of the Drepung Losaling Monastery here in Atlanta. And one of the things I've noticed about Geshe-la in the last many days is despite the whirlwind of activity, and he's very much at the center of all of this, he's been able to maintain a remarkable calm. And that's appropriate enough, I think, because he's going to speak to us now about a study, which actually the acronym is CALM, a study that uses a form of compassion training that is cognitive-based, that uses reasoning and cognition in order to invoke compassion. And so this afternoon, Your Holiness, he will speak to us about the essential elements of cognitive-based compassion training. Geshe-la.
Your Holiness, as Matthew mentioned, that it's really humbling to be in your presence and to talk about compassion, the very compassion that Your Holiness embodies. And I don't even feel like here I'm like even a spark in the presence of the fully shining sun to talk about this. But what I like to share here is a protocol to training the students into compassion meditation that we have developed here with our colleagues here, Dr. Chak Rezan, who will be speaking about the findings, of course, Brandon Osava de Silva, and another student, PhD student here, Brooke Dodson Lavelle, and central to that, all this project has been Terry Civilli, who has been the project coordinator for this project for us for many years. So in presenting this, I'll just go through the outline. What is cognitively based compassion training? How is it cognitively based? And then the protocol itself and some essential ingredients. What are the main steps that we may need in order to invoke the compassion? And then some ongoing studies employing. So what is cognitively based compassion training is, it's a training drawn from Lojong and Lamrim traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, but made completely secular, taking out the very specific Buddhist concept like the seeing all beings as mother based on the theory of reincarnation and all those things. Of the two styles of meditation that we find in Lamrim tradition or the Lojong traditions, the Jegom and Jogom, as His Holiness has encouraged the scientists and others studying the meditations to see the cognitively based or the analytical Jegom aspect of the meditation. We tried to to create a protocol that would employ a cognitively based meditation. That's Jegom style. How is it cognitively based? Your Holiness has often spoken about how compassion is biologically given some compassion towards one's mother or children and so forth. But, and Franz de Waal this morning has spoken very eloquently that how this has evolutionary basis. But the Qigong, or this particular meditation, cognitively based meditation, draws on the way that how we can deliberately train ourselves to expand that compassion, not just to our children and the parents, those very close to us, but to strangers and perhaps our adversaries as well. So the central to this approach to training the mind in compassion is what may be called the perspective changing, the changing our perspective towards others and the reality. It utilizes the analytical process. It examines and observes the one's own preconceptions of oneself and others, but all other phenomena that we interact with. And in that way, by bringing a certain change in perspective, to bring a certain inner shift in the way that we can relate to others, it aligns with the model, what is popularly known in Tibetan, Tachu Gomsum, that is to say that our view or understanding, how we see, informs our behavior, emotional or attitudinal. And if such a perspective, that the way to see the world in a positive way, and therefore to have greater immediate compassion and the nonviolence, as Your Holiness often said that the nonviolence is the outward form of compassion, that if this were to become our everyday kind of lived experiences, then we have to have meditation or the training, the process by which we can immerse ourselves or to deeply ingrain ourselves in such perspectives, and therefore the outcome would be immediate or spontaneous. This was first developed as a 6-week protocol to train our students here at Emory University, freshmen, the first-year students, in a study that Dr. Rezan designed called the Compassion Meditation as a Strategy for Reducing Depressive Symptoms in College Freshmen. This study was conducted over 5 semesters here at Emory University, 2.5 years, and then results were published. In 2010, this year, it was expanded with an NIH grant to the grown-ups, the population, to study for 5 years. The protocol itself, it was for 6 weeks, but it later expanded to 8 weeks. But the 6 week, it includes developing attention. I will talk a little bit about that. Cultivating insight into the nature of our mind, developing self-compassion. This is something that I would like to talk a little bit later, actually ask Your Holiness. Developing impartiality towards the friends, the strangers, and our adversaries. Developing appreciation and gratitude for others. Developing affection and empathy. And thus leading to the realization of wishing, aspiring, and engaging the forms of compassion. Now, the essential ingredients, what are the main steps for developing or training someone in such a compassion is, of course, that in cultures like Tibet, or the culture where the compassion is actually learned in the homes and the others around, that would maybe somewhat different. But to teach in a setting where these at least in the practice, if these are something new, it seems like that attention stability, the first part, is basic attentional stability, perhaps through the mindfulness of the breathing, and at the same time to cultivate that attentional stability, applying that mindfulness and the introspective vigilance to enhance that. The second major component is what I would like to call self-compassion. This has to do coming to an understanding of the relationship between one's own emotions and actions and one's experience of suffering and happiness, and thereby to develop a deeper sense of resolve to emerge from it. Of course, it involves sort of observing one's own thoughts, emotions, feelings, worries, fears, and so forth in a way inside meditation. I learned from one of the medical researchers that in America, actually, that the greatest number of suicides among different professionals is actually within the medical professions. The most number of suicides, also behavioral problems and like that. And his theory was that it has to do something with the training of the medical training. That when the students are exposed to like dead bodies and the suffering and like that, instead of training them to deal with them, that without such tools, they learned to simply suppress and avoid. And that being not touched with one's own feelings and so forth, further make them sort of unequipped to deal with them. So it feels like that a very kind of healthy way of looking at our own worries and fears and shortcomings, emotions, is an important step, but gaining insight that also that much of our suffering, much of our the inner suffering may not have to do with the actual situation. As Matthew pointed out, much has to do with our own distortions, our own ignorance, and the way that we don't see the things in actual reality. So ultimately, the self-compassion, therefore, that with closer look at our own emotions and so forth, seeing that how certain destructive emotions like anger or jealousy or fear lead to the greater degree of stress or suffering. And also at the same time, by observing that how when we can through the mindfulness, simply letting the mind kind of rest in that non-judgmental state, that if we can see how some of those emotions, as they subside, they unfold a certain degree of calm and peace. That's a very powerful way to see, I think, that the 3 points for self-compassion, if I may, that is, that suffering can be, or suffering and the causes of suffering, that those attachment, anger, jealousy, and so forth, can be transformed. And one has the capacity to do that. And then based on that I must overcome those inner conditions that lead to the suffering. That kind of resolve, if we can lead to the students into that, seeing the connection between the unwanted suffering and the causes that are internal mainly. And also leading them to see that those inner conditions can be transformed, and one is able to do that. That seems to be very important. And when it comes to compassion for other beings, that living as a social living beings, there, that I think as in the Lamrim Chemo, that leading to the cultivating the altruism, that as it tells that the two main components I'd like to focus is developing impartiality, which is kind of the foundation or the base, the beautiful metaphor that Lamrim Chembo Jerimbuche invokes, that is to have the full flourishing of compassion, the full harvest of compassion. We need to have the field even where the seeds of compassion are planted, and it has to be nurtured by the waters of Yong, the sense of endearment or the loving attitude towards us. So developing impartiality is when leading to compassion for oneself, if I may use that, that is to say that with a deep sense of the suffering and conditions can be overcome, and I can overcome, and therefore I must overcome. I will, to lead to that sense of feeling towards others, it feels like that impartiality, because when it is deliberately cultivated compassion, there it has the scope to expand from few to many, and the strategies there we need to change that perspective are presented as in the traditional text, that is to recognize equality of all on that common aspiration that we share to be happy and to be free from suffering. That to me seems very, very important. And if it seems that why we should be, why we should want some happiness that someone who actually harms us, the way that it is presented, another strategy to counteract that is to say that short-sightedness of basing our attitude solely on these categories of temporary friends, the strangers and enemies, because those categories change, and if we can observe in our own life, that can that can then bring that shift to seeing the world in that very solid categories of friends, enemies, and so forth, to actually to see them on that equal field. But like the water that nurtures the seeds is the sense of endearment, or the yongi jamba. And to cultivate that strategy that is presented, of course, that recognizing all beings as mother is one, but in the secular context that may not be quite applicable. So, but there are other steps that they are presented, like developing a deep sense of gratitude and for the kindness of others, as the Lojong teaching says, that Kunla Karin Chewar poems, that reflect upon the kindness of all, that teaching the others to recognize that kindness of others, within this context of interdependent world that we live in, where every bit of our comfort and joy and happiness comes from other beings. Recognizing that is very, very important, and that if we can do that, that leads then to the wishing others to be happy, and that the more we have that sense of endearment that Matthew talked about, that as the mother feels for her child, that the more there is affection or that sense of endearment, their suffering or joys will matter us. And therefore, if we witness the sorrow, the sadness, illness, and suffering of others, automatically there will be a greater sense of empathy that will lead to relief, that want to relieve the suffering of others, at least wish, and then to find some ways to do that. So that is a protocol that we have developed. Over the years that we have expanded, there are a number of the studies that are underway. That, as I mentioned, that first one was with their freshman students for 2.5 years. That another one is CALM study here at Emory University that Dr. Rezan and others are conducting. It's for 5 years. And then there is Paideia School project that my colleagues Brooke and Brandon have been conducting, and we have plans to do that. Study of cognitively based compassion training in enhancing health and well-being in adolescents in foster care in Atlanta. This is a study that we did this summer, and some of my colleagues will share about that. Grady Camp, or the Grady Compassion and Meditation, a Grady hospital here at Emory. It's a public hospital where that all the kind of the worst of the illnesses are treated. There we have did a 6-week study, and then pilot study for cognitive-based compassion training for trauma in Kosovo, and those are for the war victims, but also people who are there helping, like the nurses and doctors and so forth. So these are some of the studies applying these protocols that are being studied. Thank you so much.
Yes, so thank you very much, Geshe. It looks like you're already ready to go with a question, so please do.
So, if I may pose a question, actually there are 2 questions. The second question, probably I should go first. I wanted to ask His Holiness your take on whether the use of self-compassion is an appropriate for some form of Ngejung, that probably not the full-blown form, but this, based on this insight that this suffering can be changed, our conditions, whatever difficulty we have faced, and there's some resolve to change that. Can that be called compassion? The reason I ask this is because it seems like in the scientific field now there are studies that seem to indicate that people with the secure base, who are more secure of the 3 kinds of attachment, that they talk about the secure base, that they are most likely to respond with compassion. And here, one of the being secure, to me, it seems like that if we see a certain way out of our kind of dilemma that we may be, whatever condition that we may be facing.
His Holiness is wondering whether there is a specific meditation practice that you can use to cultivate self-compassion as such, because some degree of caring for oneself seems to be a very natural quality of the human mind. And he was giving example of many different forms of or stages of practice in the Tibetan tradition, like recognizing the preciousness of human existence and the opportunity it accords us, valuing human life, reflect meditation upon impermanence, and then true renunciation that Geshe-la was referring to, Ngenjung. All of these seems to presuppose that actually you do care for yourself. Already, yeah.
So those are all positive and sort of liberating factors. The risk with the word self-compassion is in an individualistic society is that we will be just, basically self-cherishing. There's a risk towards that. So in the sense, all the definition that you gave are very good, because it's more like recognizing that deep within, no one wants to suffer. And I wish happiness. So sometimes for people who are so-called self-hate or who went to extreme suffering and abuse, they cannot imagine the possibility of happiness. So it's painful to imagine that. But if you just have the openness to go deep within and to think that no one wakes up in the morning thinking, may I suffer the whole day, actually they thirst for happiness, but it's sort of hidden. So if you recognize that, then you only want what is really good for you, that the preciousness of human existence, instead of wanting to seize your life, or what are the causes of suffering, then how to remedy them. So all that comes into picture. And when this is clear, then it becomes much easier to transport yourself in someone else's mind and say, even that person is confused and misbehaving, but deep within, the same wish not to suffer is there. So that stage that we may call self-compassion is absolutely necessary. But the word is a bit ambiguous.
The reason that I asked, that I wanted to ask His Holiness about the use of self-compassion, if the compassion for others is the wish for others to be happy, and that if it is the greatest and most powerful when it is equipped with a deep conviction that other suffering can be ended. Same thing, based on the insight that our suffering can be ended, and we have the power to, and therefore wish to overcome one's suffering, that resolve, could that be self-compassion?
In any case, without the basis of some sense of caring for oneself, it's difficult to generate compassion for others, which involves caring for others' welfare. In a text by Buddha Palita, 3rd century, about 2nd to 3rd, 4th century, he gives a beautiful analogy. He gives the analogy of a particular flower. Is it jasmine or it can't be jasmine?
I think it's jasmine, yes.
Yeah, it's probably jasmine flower, which has a beautiful scent. And Buddha Palita says that if the jasmine flower does not possess the scent by itself, it won't be able to share its perfume in the environment with others. Similarly, with relation to compassion, if you don't have a basic capacity to care for yourself, then you are not going to be able to have that capacity to care for others' welfare. So, sorry, the context was slightly different. The analogies was used in a different context where he gives this analogy of jasmine flower, which must have its own scent to be able to then share it with others. He was using in a philosophical context, but that analogy can be used in the context of compassion. So if an individual does not possess the natural capacity to care for himself or herself, their own well-being, then that person will not have the ability to then extend that to others. And similarly, with relation to suffering, if you are not able to recognize the nature of suffering in relation to your own existence and have some kind of understanding of that, then you're not going to be able to empathize with others' sufferings. So basically, from the Buddhist point of view, it is actually quite conceptually difficult to kind of imagine any creature that just doesn't care for himself or herself, because so long as there is some sense of individual identity, then there is going to be built within this some mechanism that involves, and on the basis of that sense of identity, if there is a basic capacity for experience of pain and happiness, or pain and pleasure, then built within that mechanism is some ability to care for oneself and seek what is required.
Well, this discussion I think we could have, we've already taken a little time from the end, in fact, in order to speak about this very important topic, and maybe we'll come back to it, because I do know, Your Holiness, that Geshe-la has mentioned to me how important this is in a clinical context for people who are receiving this kind of intervention to really be able to feel something like compassion for themselves. So perhaps we will come back to this at the end of the afternoon. But for the moment, let's thank Geshe Losang Tenzin. And you go take Chuck's seat. And now allow me to introduce to you someone else you already know, and that is Professor Charles Razoner, Chuck as we know him. He is a tenured professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science in Emory's Medical School, and he's the clinical director of our Mind-Body program. He's also been a very important figure in establishing the Collaborative for Contemplative Studies here. You've heard a lot about our compassion meditation studies, but there are actually many professors here at Emory who are working on various aspects of meditation. And in some sense, we're just getting a slice out of a much larger picture. Chuck has been very important in forming that group. And you also, I think, met his two very cute twin boys on Saturday outside of Drepung Los Ling Monastery.
When you came into the monastery.
So that says a lot about how Chuck can manage such a busy life and still be such a great father. So Chuck, this afternoon, Your Holiness is going to speak a little bit about the kind of research. You saw a slide at the end of Geshe-la's presentation, a slide about all the research that's been going on, and Chuck is going to give us a report from the front lines, an update on health relevant effects of compassion meditation studies at Emory. So Your Holiness, let me present to you Chuck Razoner.
So Your Holiness, a couple years ago, you and I sat here and I showed you some data in Emory kids, that in college kids, the more they practiced Geshe Lobsang's version of compassion meditation, the more they had a reduction in stress hormones and in inflammation, when we put them in a stress test. And so this really suggested that if you engaged with the practice, it might be something that'd be really beneficial, given that we know that these stress hormones and inflammatory chemicals give you a lot of bad health in the modern world. It's what makes you feel sick if you get like a virus, or it causes a lot of unhappiness. So it suggests that we might look to populations that could especially benefit from having these chemicals turned down. And in this regard, I show you a painful picture to start with. I saw this on the web and took it off. We know that children that are maltreated as they're growing up, that it devastates their lives in a lot of ways. And there are now many, many studies showing that if you compare children who have been neglected or abused to ones who have not been, the neglected or abused kids show abnormal stress hormones. So things like cortisol, they're either too high or too low. It sort of depends on when you catch them. And they have too much of this inflammation. There's a lot of problems with this, but there's some basic biological problems. These chemicals, the hormones and the inflammatory chemicals, cause the brain to function in a way that's not best for the modern world, especially. It can make you a setup for things like diabetes, and it can actually damage blood vessels in your body and brain. So, not surprisingly, we now know that if these chemicals are too high and they lead to those problems, that's a setup for everything from depression and anxiety to heart attacks and diabetes. These people have lots of aches and pains in their body. And just recently I saw a study, it was literally presented a couple of weeks ago, that children that have been abused or neglected die 7 to 15 years sooner than children that are not abused or neglected. Yeah. Everything else being equal. It's a very powerful effect. And what it suggests, of course, is that there's something about danger early in life that from an evolutionary perspective makes a set point within the organism so that it has to look at the world as always being dangerous. And it pays this very high price. I wanted to show you a study that doesn't have to do with neglect and abuse in childhood, but this is a study that was your sister's idea. So Mrs. Pema, when I visited her many years ago at the Tibetan Children's Village, worried that the children that were coming from Tibet were more unhappy and more anxious. So we agreed to study it. And we actually gave questionnaires to about 500. And what you can see is that the children that were born in Tibet are the blue. The children that were, and the children that were born in India are the red. And what's very apparent is if you go this way, it's more depressed. If you go that way, more anxious. You can see that most of the blue marks are way up where the depression and the anxiety are high. And most of the marks for the children that were born and raised in the relative peace and security of India are much lower. So all over the world, this looks like a hardwired response, that if young people are put into situations that are overwhelming and threatening, they certainly get anxiety and depression. We now know they get heart disease and cancer and dementia and all these illnesses. So this is a huge problem. If one wants to study it in the United States, one could do no better than turning to children who are in foster care. So these are children who are taken out away from their parents, almost always because of some type of abuse or neglect. That's one problem. So they're taken out of an environment where they're being badly treated. Nature did a cruel experiment during World War II. When the bombings began in London and in other parts of Europe, they actually took the children away from the mothers who stayed in London, and they took the children out to places like this. Many years later, just in the last couple of years, they've done studies of people that either kids that stayed in London with all the bombing or went to places like this but did not have their mothers. And what they found was it was the kids who were separated from their mothers, even though they were in these safe environments, that had lifetimes of depression, lifetime of anxiety, medical illness. So it was better to be dodging the bombs and have your mother with you than to be out. So this tells, so foster children suffer a double hit. They're taken away from their mothers and fathers. Even if the mothers and fathers are abusing them, it breaks the children's heart. And they very often are desperately trying to return to their families of origin. So this study was a huge effort by many people. And unfortunately, she couldn't come here today at the last minute, but I wanted to really commend the State Commissioner of Georgia of Human Services. This is B.J. Walker. She heard a lecture that Geshe-la and I gave, and she became convinced that compassion training would be something that would benefit these foster kids, and she went to no ends of trouble to finally make it happen. He is here today. This is Lamar. She deputized him with doing all the hard work in terms of, he was like a general in an army. He ran probably 100 people. And if Lamar had not done this, and he's an executive with the state, it never could have happened. Similarly, at Emory, Dr. Linda Craighead and her graduate student, Sheetal Reddy, they are the ones that really did all the assessments. They did a ton of work. These people were instrumental. I'm up here talking about it today, but the study really is a result of their dedication and hard work. So let me tell you a little bit about what we did. We took 72 foster kids. They were between the ages of 13 and 17, and we did an assessment. And so we had them come in, and we asked them questionnaires about, are they depressed? Are they nervous? Do they believe they have a good future? Lots of questionnaires. But we also got saliva from their mouth to measure those stress hormones and that inflammation. And then after we did that, we flipped a coin. Half of them got the CBCT, the compassion training. Half of them just waited. So unlike Richie's studies, which are more sophisticated, where he actually had a control condition where they did something, for this first effort, all we did was just have them wait for 6 weeks. So they got 6 weeks of training, or they waited for 6 weeks, so then we assessed them again. And then after that, the kids that waited got the training. We didn't fail, and the kids that had the training waited, and we assessed them again. But today I'm only going to show you this, so this first phase. And we had two questions, or we had two hypotheses. One was that the kids that were randomly put in the compassion training would be less anxious, less depressed, be more hopeful about the future. And based on what we found with the Emory kids, we expected that within the group that got the compassion, the more they practiced, the better they would feel, right? So you know how science is, it doesn't always give you what you want, you know. So we found no difference between the groups, right? So just being randomized and going to the class, that didn't make a difference. In terms of their self-reported, like what they said about themselves, there was a little bit of a suggestion that if they kept practicing, especially in the back part of the study, they began to feel a little bit less anxious, a little more hopeful. But remember that we also got that saliva. And this is a really interesting, because this is what we saw with the kids in Emory too. We thought the same thing, that if you looked at the groups, that the group that got compassion would have less inflammation, less hormones, and that the more they practiced, the more we'd see that. Well, again, if you looked at the groups, there was not a statistical difference. So again, just being randomized doesn't seem to do it. But here we have practice time with the inflammation and the stress hormones. And what it shows, it's like all the correlation, it's not perfect. But in general, within the group that got the training, the more they practiced, the lower their inflammation went. And the more they practiced, the less of that stress hormone they had. So this is very promising. This is exactly what we saw with the Emory kids. The groups didn't differ, but if they practiced, they saw the benefits in these same systems. So it's very consistent to suggest that maybe these objective physical findings change faster than self-report, which has made us wonder if there was some way to objectively look at behavior. So rather than just basing on what you tell me about yourself, is there some way that I can actually see what you're doing? And here we collaborated with a group in Arizona, and especially Dr. Matthias Mell, who's out in the audience today. And he has invented a ingenious little device that I actually brought to show you, but the audience can see it on the screen. It's a little device that you wear, and it's got a little microphone. And most of the time it's turned off. It goes on randomly 1 minute out of every 10 minutes. So for every 10 minutes, 9 minutes, nothing. But it comes on for a minute. And so people, being people, think, it's not on. And so what Matthias has shown is that you really capture people doing everything. Going to the bathroom, having fights, you name it. It's a way of actually looking at how people behave in their lives. I read about his work and I realized it offered a huge opportunity for meditation. You could get people to wear it before they got training and after. You could look to see whether meditation actually changed how people behave. And here we don't have a lot of data in his hand. But we have just the first 25 people, and I wanted to show you this in closing because it's very interesting. So this is from the CALM study that Geshe-la talked about. There's a control group, a mindfulness group, and a compassion, a CBCT group. And what we found was that compared to the control group and the group that just got pure mindfulness, the compassion group spent less time by themselves. So this is compared to themselves, right? So from start to finish, they spent more time with other people. Instead of having shallow talk, like about sports or things that don't matter, they began to talk honestly about their feelings. They also had a big change in how much time they spent laughing. So they sighed less, they laughed more. And really interestingly, if you rate how often they said something empathic to other people, it actually went up. Now you can see the other groups went down in some of these measures. I think it's because they got used to wearing the box. And so they became more and more sort of open. But these are very, very large differences. And if this is a very small sample, but if they persist, it might really suggest that the compassion training is doing something rather unique in terms of how people actually behave, which is, yeah, it's very interesting, and it's very important, we think. So this is what we're trying to do. Obviously, what we really want to do is stop the early problems. That's what we should be doing as a society. But that's hard to do. Meantime, we've been trying to see if we can take CBCT, administer it early in life, and have the results of that adversity shrink so that over time, people have less of these problems. It's really kind of the way to say it. And as Geshe-la alluded, there are lots of people who have been involved with this work. I forgot a few people, for which I apologize. But this is a huge sort of thing that's developed at Emory now that's very exciting for me, and I hope will bear fruit in terms of finding ways to educate young people, especially young people at risk, for different ways of looking at the world that will give them better outcomes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Your Holiness, do you have some thoughts or questions or reactions to this? I hear you saying wonderful, and it is actually.
So it clearly shows that if you train, there's a benefit.
So that's confirmed, proved
It's a proof.
by scientific sort of finding. Very good.
And the body seems to respond, or the physical seems to respond before people are aware of it in a way, which is something we've seen now in 2 studies, which is very interesting, and it really points to how important it is, like others are doing, to have objective measures of heart rate or brain function, because it may be that the body-brain changes, and then later the mind begins to be aware of it. I mean, nobody's ever really studied that, but we've wondered, and I actually wondered from a Buddhist perspective if something like that would make sense.
So in Buddhist Vajrayana physiology, we speak of a very intimate connection between movements of prana or vayu, which is kind of literally translated as wind, energy, and its relationship with consciousness and different levels of consciousness. So whatever changes that occurs is also going to be occurring at the physical level in that sense, at that subtle. So it may be the case that sometimes the changes occur at that subtle and deeper level, and it may take time for the individual to become conscious or aware of those processes. That may be the case.
So that wind is some kind of subtle energy which the movement you want energy. Mind is the doyache. The energy the doyache.
So in this model of mind, mind is really seen as the kind of the cognitive, the mental aspect of the process, and that which brings that mobility, being able to project to something, engage with an object or an experience. That is thought to be the function of this vayu or wind or energy, subtle energy.
That basically, that is the compare mind, that is solid. So that relates with inner 5 elements. Inner 5 elements also the more grosser level, more subtle level. So that energy linked with the more subtle level, the 5 energy, 5 elements. 5 elements. That 5 element, the subtle level 5 element related with grosser level 5 element. That's the body totally equal.
So of course, in this way, the connection with the body is understood. Yeah. So it is true. It may be the case that in some processes, when the kind of process of change is beginning to occur at a subtler level, the individual may not be able to recognize it, become aware of it.
Of
course, I don't know. That might be one way of looking at this process.
I must say this sounds like yet another topic that we could discuss for a very long time, Your Holiness. But I'm afraid we need to move on, and I think happily so. So thank you very much, Chuck. And I say happily so because now we also get to hear a little bit more about how concretely this practice that Chuck has been talking about has also been implemented with children. Because Brendan Ozawa da Silva here has been directly involved in helping to create this protocol for children and teaching it to children, foster children, children at Paideia School, and so on. Brendan actually already has a PhD from Oxford University, which he got in 2003, if memory serves correctly. And he must be someone who really likes to study because now he's working on another PhD here at Emory University. And in fact, he's technically my student, but I don't see him very much. He's been so busy helping prepare for your visit here. So Brendan this afternoon is going to speak to us about that protocol, and his talk is entitled Educating the Heart and Mind, Teaching Cognitive-Based Compassion Training to Children. Brendan.
Thank you, John. Your Holiness, let me just say once again what a tremendous honor it is for us to have you here with us. It's been an inspiration to the administration, the faculty, and the students, such as myself, in so many ways. And what I'll be talking about today comes directly from a vision for education that Your Holiness shared with us. Dan Goldman mentioned it this morning at the Destructive Emotions Conference, but also I learned about it through transcribing a talk that you had with Emory officials a couple of years back, at which Geshe Lobsangla was present, in which you talked about first studying the nature of destructive and constructive emotions through science, understanding their nature, and then on that basis developing tools for educating society but also educating children in schools. And then maybe 100 years from now, seeing the results of that, when those children who have benefited from these trainings and teachings grow up, what kind of a more compassionate, peaceful world we live in. And that massive, long-term view for humanity was so inspiring to me that was the chief reason why I wanted to come back to graduate school and do this work. So thank you for that. Chuck, Geshe Lobsang has already talked about the nature of the protocol. Chuck has talked about some of the results. And I'll talk about, now that we have some evidence for understanding the positive and negative aspects of certain emotions, of translating and bringing that into practice. And it only occurred to me actually sitting here in the audience this morning that threefold path follows the Buddhist model of the ground, path and fruit. And this is the model that I just spoke about. The need for a balanced education. Your Holiness, you have often talked about how you greatly admire modern education. That's one of the reasons why you have championed the idea of science education for monks, which we are now doing here at Emory with the Emory Tibet Science Initiative. But you've also spoken about how modern education lacks certain elements. It has such great resources for understanding the external world around us and the material world, but not enough resources for understanding ourselves, our own minds, emotions, and for building a sense of responsibility, a sense of inner confidence that comes from developing compassion. So our attempt has been to work with children to bring about a more balanced form of education. And the foster care study that Chuck just presented research from, we initially piloted that program for a group foster home here of 6 girls in Metro Atlanta. They were ages 13 to 16, to see whether we could translate the protocol that Geshe Lobsang La had developed to a younger age population. What's interesting, this program was 8 weeks long. We visited the home once per week. We utilized the program that Geshe Lobsang La created, but we changed, the way we presented it was very much for these foster children as a way of cultivating inner strength, strong relationships, the ability to deal with emotions. So we had already been teaching this to Emory undergraduates. And Emory undergraduates are wonderful academically. They want to excel academically. They also deal with a lot of academic stress. They really appreciated the mindfulness practice as a way of being able to deal with that stress and also become smarter and be able to use their minds more productively. For these foster girls, academic excellence was not their first priority. In fact, they weren't terribly interested in the beginning parts of the protocol that deal with mindfulness and so forth. But when we, and in fact, I and my colleague Brooke Dodson-Lavelle, who is my partner in developing these programs, despaired a little bit as to whether they would actually find any interest in that. But when we reached the part about relations, the relational aspect of this practice, that's when they really tuned in to the practice and became very engaged. And by the end of the program, there were 2 girls in particular who had become so attracted to this program. One started meditating every day, she said, for an hour or so every day. And she even testified in court when she had to go to court with her, because she has an adopted mother and there are various legal issues about where she lives and so forth. She talked about, before the judge and before the officers from the state system, about how much this practice had transformed her, how, because of her experiences, she had thought that she would have to clamp down emotionally, not be open, not share with others, protect herself. But through this practice, she realized that in order to really lead a genuine, happy life, she would have to develop the inner strength to be able to relate to others and show compassion to others and forgiveness. And that was so inspiring for the judge there, that the judge said, oh, this program should be implemented much more widely. And we were fortunate to get the support of the state and be able to do that. So if that one girl had not practiced so much, I don't know whether we'd be able to present this, so we owe a lot to her. Then that seemed too easy, so we decided, what about children who are really young, who are only 5 to 8? You heard from Geshe Lobsang La's presentation. It's cognitive-based compassion meditation is really very conceptual. It involves teaching concepts about interdependence, about the nature of suffering, the causes of suffering, the nature of one's own mind, that are challenging and new sometimes even for adults when we teach them. So we wondered, would it be possible to bring these concepts and these practices to children who are only 5, 6, 7, 8 years old? And fortunately, we were invited by Barbara Dunbar at the Paideia School to come into their school. And after an initial observation period of several months to learn the culture of the school and find age-appropriate ways of conveying the concepts of CBCT to these children, Brooke Dodson-Lavelle and I developed a program in which we visited 3 classes for 8 weeks with 2 visits per week of 25 or so minutes. And we taught cognitive-based compassion training through games, stories, plays, and guided meditations during each visit, with the goal of eventually creating a curriculum for school use in general. Once again, in the beginning of this program, I don't know how Brooke felt, but at least I was almost in despair, thinking these young children, they wouldn't even sit still for one moment if we asked them, if we tried to say, well, try closing your eyes. It was too exciting for them. You know, they wouldn't even close their eyes for 1 second, or they just close and then open. Even if we'd asked them, are your eyes closed? They say, yes, with their eyes fully open. So we didn't know whether this was going to have any impact on them at all. But over the period of the 8 weeks, we really became convinced, and I think the teachers also along with us, of the ability of even these small children to grasp the essential ingredients of CBCT that Geshe Lobsang La talked about. I'll just give you two examples that really surprised us. One was the concept of interdependence, which is, even for adults, sometimes a mind-blowing idea when they realize how interdependent, how interconnected we are. We did this with all 3 classrooms. We went in, and I brought a sweater that my father had given to me, one of my favorite sweaters. And I said, I have this sweater, it keeps me warm, I enjoy it, it's comfortable. When I wear it, I feel happy because I think of my father. And I said, what do I need to be able to enjoy this sweater? What other things do I need? What other people do I need? You know, did this sweater just come out of nowhere? And the children said, no, of course you need your father. So I said, oh yeah, of course I need my father. Without him I wouldn't have this sweater. So my father, I wonder how he got the sweater. I wonder if he just kind of pulled it out of thin air, or he just found it on the ground somewhere. And they said, no, of course not. You know, it's a wool sweater, so you know, he needed to buy it in a store. So I said, oh, okay, so stores create, they kind of magically create wool sweaters? I said, no, wool, it comes from sheep, and then you have to cut the sheep, and you have shears. So they're thinking I was pretty stupid by this time. You need, and then I said, oh, what else do you need? So, we have to do something to reach out to these children. But they went on and on. The more, you know, that Brooke and I prompted them, the more they went on. You need roads, and you need the farmers, and you need the food, and the people who make the food, the people who grow the food, and so on and so forth. And all these people need their families, and they need their parents, and their parents need parents, and so forth. And finally, after 10, 15 minutes of this, we asked them, so it seems to be going out further and further, where does it end? And they just shouted out instantly, it never ends. You need the whole world. And we thought, wow, this is a lot easier than we thought. And then one child said, even children like us, I mean, you know, even we are connected in this whole web of things that you need. And that was an incredible and moving comment to hear. And there are so many examples of that. One element of the practice which is so important is understanding suffering and the causes of suffering, and how the mind itself, that suffering doesn't just come from external sources, but from the mind itself. For that we use the example of forest fires, how when a forest fire is raging, what can you do to stop it? And then we'd ask them, well, how does a forest fire start? Does it start as this raging fire? They say, no, of course not. It can just start as just a spark. So when it starts as a spark, that's when you can stop it. Similarly, with anger and other destructive emotions, you need to recognize them early, stop them just when they're arising. And you know, once again, I wondered, you know, are they really grasping this? But right after we finished that, one of the youngest boys came up to me and said, there are too many forest fires in my life. So again and again, we felt that these children were making these insights. Of course, we have no doubt that there's a need for repetition and training for these little fleeting insights to become deeply ingrained in this knowledge. But we have hope for that as well, because one of the things we found is that there is a difference between a randomized controlled trial, the way that meditation is often studied, and which is a wonderful method, and going into classrooms and teaching. Unlike a controlled trial where you're bringing people from different settings, they come, they're taught briefly, and then they go back to their own lives. The children are together day in and day out, and they're with the teachers. So they're learning this behavior together to create a culture of compassion in the classroom. And the role of teachers is extremely important in maintaining this. And what we found was afterwards the teachers were continuing to teach this, and not just in the ways that we had, but actually teaching the other subjects they were teaching as methods for teaching compassion. So 2 teachers told Brooke and myself afterwards, you know, we teach who Martin Luther King is every year when the holiday named after him comes up. But this time, for the first time, we realized his story is a story about compassion. It's a story about impartiality, about caring for others, about forgiveness. And so they were actually teaching it in a whole new way. That's very inspiring for us. So just to summarize, the ground of this, the first stage, is to engage in the scientific research on the nature of constructive and destructive emotions. And we know through the presentations, I don't have to go through all this, we're in limited time, but just as we share bodies, we also share cognitive structures. But the mind is not a black box. However, these structures, which even have evolutionary basis, as Franz was talking about, are not written in stone. They're not permanent or fixed. They can be cultivated. And therefore, that opens the way to, through training the mind, cultivate them by drawing upon what I've called embodied cognitive logics, the idea that reasoning plays a key role in our affect. As you were saying before in this morning session, that wisdom can go in the direction of compassion, supports compassion. And this knowledge about mind and emotions can be used to develop programs that introduce secular ethics into the classroom. However, programs like CBCT or normative, they're explicitly about the cultivation of what Your Holiness has called universal human values. So if such educational models are to be implemented widely, they must indeed be accepted as universal and secular, not religious. Therefore, if we were to reach the next stage of the fruits, of seeing the society that can come from this, it seems a question remains. And that's the question I'd like to end by posing to Your Holiness, which is that many people in our country still don't believe in the possibility of truly secular ethical reasoning and secular ethical practices that neither rely upon religious thought nor oppose religious thought. So how can we introduce secular ethics into the public sphere, such as public education, in a way that's fully vibrant, fully engaged, fully ethical, but that does not promote a particular religion and is not understood either as opposing or standing in the way of religion? Thank you.
Your Holiness, it looks like an excellent question to me, so maybe this would be a good way to start the conversation. We'll have a few minutes here in the afternoon. We've taken some time in between for conversation, so we can start now and end in about 10 minutes.
No, I think firstly, yes, some of my friends believe the ethics must be based on religious belief, religious faith. Of course, the former last was the Pope, the Polish Pope, a wonderful Pope. Since eventually we become very close. So one time, at one audience, I actually asked him whether sort of moral ethics not based on religious faith is possible. He remained silent. But then his lieutenant, the one, I think cardinal, he said, oh no, the moral ethics must be based on religious faith. So, as you mentioned, you see people, when they heard the secular is something disrespect about religion or rejection of religion. But in India, The secularism means respect all religions. No preference, this religion or that religion. And then also, you see, some time back, one occasion, was at a meeting with former Deputy Prime Minister of India, Mr. Advani. He mentioned to me one of the reasons democracy successful in India is that in India, the 1,000 years, there are so many different religious philosophy, religious sort of viewpoint there. And then one sort of philosophical view, they're called Charvaka. That means denying existence of God or Buddha or existence of next life, these things, simply this life. So that, I think, ancient Indian nihilism. So then he mentioned to me the rest of Indian school of thought criticize that view as a nihilism, argue or even condemn. But the person who holding that view refer rishi. Rishi means
Sage.
sage. So that means the view are opposing, but the person who holding that view respect. So India's secularism also respect non-believer. So since respect ancient non-believer, so today's non-believer also, I think, must respect. Then, of course, obviously, like Mahatma Gandhi, and also I remember the first Indian president, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, great lawyer. He one of the lawyer who drafted India's constitution. And Mahatma Gandhi also involved. These people who create constitution based on secularism, these people individually very, very religious minded. So certainly secularism does not mean disrespect to religion. Very clear. And that, I think, idea is developed because of the reality. In India, 1,000 years, different institutions remain there, beside homegrown religion, such as some ancient Hinduism, different Hinduism, and then Buddhism, Jainism, more than now 2,000 years, and then later Sikhism, these religion, homegrown religion. And from outside, I think first from Iran or Parsi, Zoroastrian. That actually very small population, very small community. They settled in Bombay. Now their whole population less than 100,000. Very small, but they completely freedom. They carry their own religion. They never feel some kind of threat. I think this small community made, I think, a great sort of contribution for India's development, like Tata, great economist, businessman, Parsi, and one, I think, Indian, later become Field Marshal, Manekshaw. He also Parsi. So it's a very small group, but they have complete freedom on their sort of religious faith, like that. And then, of course, Christian, and Islam, Judaism. So all world majority tradition lived together in that country last, I think, 3,000 years, no, 2,000, more than 2,000 years. So according to that reality, the constitution should be secular. Otherwise, it's difficult. Now in India, I think Muslim population, I think number 2 country, first Indonesia, the second India. There are much more, so much bigger number of Muslims in India than Pakistan, like that. All equal, complete freedom. That, I think, because of the secular constitution, like that. So I always say, wherever I give talk, I always say, now it is quite obvious, compassion, or sense of closeness feeling, or sense of their concern for others' well-being is something really now need. Now the way promoting these value, one, theistic religion, accept God as the infinite love, and then you yourself totally submission to God. That means reduce your self-centered attitude. The Buddhist method is selflessness philosophy. But here, theistic religion, no such talking, but the sort of tremendous single-pointed faith to God. I think effect more or less same. And then other hand is God, infinite love, or Allah, God, infinite love. So that automatically is bring more sort of the enthusiasm. The person who believes that also should practice love and compassion. So this is one way. The second way, like Buddhism, law of causality. If you do harm other, you get negative consequences. If you help other, bring some happiness to other, you get benefit. So believe that concept. So through that way, reduce harming other, helping other as much as you can. So that's one way, promoting compassion. Now there should be a third one, secular way now. These theistic way or non-theistic way will not be universal. So now we need a universal sort of approach. There's no other alternative except the secular way. So even someone doesn't like the secularism, but you have to follow that. That's my view. That's my view. So then I think secularism, very broad. So you can take some from Buddhism, from Christian, from Islam, from if some suitable sort of thing, yeah, take. Then mainly based on scientific sort of research. So suddenly, secularism,
secular approach can definitely be possible.
That's the only way. That's the only way.
One of the key questions about drawing from those different traditions, you said drawing from Christianity, Islam, that seems so important to creating a genuine secular ethics. You've talked about dividing the Buddhist tradition conceptually into Buddhist science, Buddhist philosophy, and Buddhist religious practice. That seems one way of doing that. But this is a very difficult idea for many of us to understand, because I've actually approached some Christians and Jews and others and said, well, could you separate that? But Christian science, actually, that's a religious tradition, has a very different connotation. And Jewish, taking out the secular elements of those traditions is something that seems very hard for many of us to conceptualize. And even many of us from the Buddhist tradition find it very hard to clearly separate what is the religious part and what is the secular, scientific part of the understanding of the mind.
So, Brandon, earlier you briefly alluded to the Buddhist kind of category of ground, path, and fruit, or the result.
I think the very way Buddha taught Four Noble Truths. Rinpoche Tembashi Sonzana, Rinpoche Shesongdua, Tenshi Mol and Devil, Tenshi Chawan and Devil, Chawan Devil Devils.
So, for example, if you look at the Buddha's public sermon on the Four Noble Truths, we understand that turning of the wheel to be done on the kind of three different levels, as it were. First, in relation to the nature of the truth themselves. Then second, in relation to the functions of that understanding of these four truths. Which includes also the practice. How do we go about implementing the knowledge? And then finally, what are the results, the fruits of that kind of path and practice?
First level, simply introduce the reality. Not talking how to deal. The second level, because of that reality, because we do not want suffering. So now, how to deal these Four Noble Truths. Then third, if you deal that way, what do you gain? So that third level. So the first level, it seems to me just a science, just to introduce the reality. Nothing to say this is positive, this is negative. Simply the reality. Suffering, reality. Its causes, reality. Then possibility of the elimination or permanent sort of happiness, that also reality. Of course, now that, although reality, like the concept of, the basis of the possibility of elimination of suffering is the ultimate reality is absence of independent existence. So, absence of independent existence is the basis of possibility of change, possibility of law of causality. If things independently exist, then cannot change. Good is good, always good. Bad is always bad. So although that is the because of that, some kind of religious sort of concept or philosophical concept, but that's reality. So I consider the first sort of portion, that's simply Buddhist science. I feel like that. So with that, the many many texts explain about external particles or internal mind. When explain these things, the religion gets shed.
So at that level of explanation, which pertains just purely to the description of reality, then there is no moral or soteriological evaluation brought in, suggesting that these are things that need to be avoided, these are things that need to be cultivated. That evaluation is not part of that first level of explanation.
Science reality.
So although the term science is being added to that dimension of Buddhist explanation, but the classical description of that aspect of the traditional thought is referred to as the ground. And when we talk about ground, we're talking about the nature of reality. What is reality?
This idea has come in our meeting, Life and Mind, my life of the meeting, initially, the concerned people used to use the word dialogue, Buddhism and modern science. Then I thought, this is not correct. We are not discussing with modern scientists about next life or about the possibility of nirvana or salvation. No, these are something beyond today's sort of science, right? Like that. In future science, maybe more deal with after this death, or any possibility of elimination of destructive emotion. Then maybe is touching with concept of salvation. But these are truly Buddhist business. So therefore, in order to make clear, we are engaging with modern scientists about reality. A conventional way, or also occasionally related with some sort of syndrome of ultimate reality. That is the concept of interdependency, no absolute. So only mainly Buddhist science, not talking right or wrong, just fact. That's Buddhist science. Then Buddhist concept of Buddhist philosophy, like interdependency, concept of interdependency.
Dependent origination.
Also momentarily changing, impermanence, momentarily. These things, some occasionally involved, but nothing to do with Buddhist religion. And then also, Buddhist science, Buddhist philosophy can, in some extent, in the Buddhist philosophy, can be universal.
Can be seen as universal.
Buddhist religion is only for Buddhist. And I think the differences, the other theistic religion, you see, differences, religion based on law of causality, religion which is based on faith. Faith, those religions based on faith, the importance is faith. Not much sort of because they involve about different emotions. Faith, one because of I think something like one medicine, which 100 illness, something like that. So all other, faith
So in those kind of predominantly theistic religions where faith is the central element of an individual's practice, then faith can be seen as a kind of a single remedy for multitude of ailments. And it is by the sheer application of faith that many of the problems that we can understand as being primarily mental and psychological and spiritual can be overcome.
Although present, His Holiness Pope is the emphasis, faith, reasons. And that's also very good. That's very good. I recall one time, I think Archbishop, Brazil, many years ago, we gathered, he also there. He mentioned to me, Christianity is so rational. Buddhism is not rational. Of course, he sees that kind of situation. So, on the basis of faith, you see, he sees some rational. So, in any way, so Buddhism and Jainism, they are whole sort of concept based on law of causality. So you have to deal with different emotions and how to deal with these emotions. Therefore, the more detailed explanation about mind, about emotion, and its counterforce. So that's the way to come. So in any way, your main question is secular, what? Secular. I think we have to promote secularism. Does not mean, I mean, there is possibility moral ethics based on secularism. We have to promote that, and we have to work the top of the water.
So we have to work hard to try to elevate the kind of fears and suspicions that people may have about the untenability of the secular ethics.
Well, Your Holiness, that sounds like an excellent charge to all of us, and a challenge as well. And I hope that it will be the basis for an ongoing conversation next time you come to Emory University.
Thank you.
We've had a wonderful day.
One word. I just want, years, so I wish some kind of concrete sort of plan, research on these sort of the benefit out of practice of compassion. Now you actually implementing here. So now these are real sort of concrete basis of new curriculum to educate secular way from kindergarten level up to university. So this is really wonderful. It looks like it's some kind of dawn, right?
It sounds like there's a dawning of a new day.
Wonderful. Thank you.